In 1884, the most terrifying way to die on the frontier wasn't a bullet, it was a glass of water. As the foam bubbled on his lips and his throat slammed shut like a rusted trap, his family realized the man they loved was gone. Only a twitching, barking nightmare remained. And the only mercy left was a heavy pillow and a wife with no other choice. Civilization on the American frontier was never a majestic march of progress, it was more like a creeping gangrene devouring the flesh of the prairies to the accompaniment of false psalms. By the late 19th century, humanity had already begun to fancy itself the crown of creation, yet across the vast expanses of Kansas or Nebraska, this supposed grandeur evaporated alongside the sweat of exhausted horses. The Wild West did not smell of freedom, but of decomposition, of unwashed bodies, and the congealed blood of slaughtered livestock. Here, nature did not play the role of a majestic temple, but rather that of an indifferent vivisector, for whom a human life held no more value than dry grass under the hooves of a buffalo herd. The most perverted instrument of this executioner was hydrophobia, a madness that transformed a man into a defective biological mechanism destined for total destruction. The year 1884 did not bring enlightenment to the plains, but rather a deepening of the desperate struggle for caloric survival. The landscape was a monochromatic wasteland of brown and gray, where the wind acted as a whetstone, grinding down the spirit and the skin of those foolish enough to claim ownership over the dirt. Men were not pioneers in their own minds, they were merely biological laborers, disposable components in an economic machine designed to extract wealth for rail barons and land speculators. Every sod house was a damp grave lined with dirt, where families huddled together in a collective stench of poverty and unwashed wool. The proximity of man to beast was not a pastoral ideal, but a filthy necessity, as the warmth of cattle was often the only thing standing between a child and a frozen death. The American dream was a malignant growth, drawing thousands into a geography that fundamentally rejected their presence. These settlers were walking casualties of an expansionist policy that viewed their lives as acceptable losses in the conquest of the continent. They arrived with Bibles and rusted plows, only to find that the soil was a hard, unforgiving crust that broke their tools and their backs with equal indifference. Water was a rare and precious commodity, often brackish and teeming with the invisible agents of typhoid and cholera, yet it was the lack of it that defined their existence. In this environment, the human body was reduced to its most basic functions, a fragile vessel of meat and bone constantly threatened by the overwhelming weight of the elements and the predatory nature of the land itself. In a small, windowless cabin on the edge of a nameless creek, a man lived whose identity has been swallowed by the relentless passage of time. He was a typical product of the frontier, a creature of heavy muscle and dulled intellect, shaped by the repetitive violence of manual labor. His hands were gnarled like the roots of a dead oak, and his lungs were perpetually filled with the fine, alkaline dust of the high plains. To the bankers in the East, he was a line of credit, to the local land office, he was a temporary occupant of Section 42. He existed on a diet of salt pork and cornmeal, a nutritional deficit that left his immune system as brittle as the winter wheat. He was the perfect host, a blank canvas upon which the most horrific of nature's designs was about to be sketched. One night, as the temperature plummeted and the moon hung like a cold, lidless eye over the prairie, a small predator approached the dwelling. This animal, a common striped skunk, was not driven by the rational requirements of hunger or the territorial instincts of its species. Instead, it was an organic puppet, its brain a chaotic landscape of inflammation and viral replication. The rabies virus had already hijacked its central nervous system, turning a naturally cautious creature into a fearless, twitching agent of infection. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its fur matted with frozen saliva and the filth of the burrows. It did not see a cabin or a human, it saw only a target for the neurological rage that demanded it bite and tear until the cycle could begin anew. The skunk slipped through a gap in the rotting floorboards, a dark shape moving through the gloom of the interior. The man slept on a pallet of corn husks, his breathing a heavy, rhythmic rasp that masked the subtle scratching of the intruder. There was no warning, no dramatic confrontation between man and beast in the moonlight. There was only a sharp, needle-like puncture as the animal's teeth sank into the fleshy part of the man's thumb. He awoke with a startled cry, flinging the small weight off his hand and into the shadows, where it disappeared back into the night. The wound was tiny, a mere pair of crimson dots that barely dripped onto the dry husks of his bed, appearing no more significant than a splinter or a bramble scratch. In the morning, the man looked at his hand with the weary apathy of a person accustomed to minor injuries. He wiped the dried blood on his trousers and went out to tend to the livestock, unaware that the biological clock of his demise had already begun its first quiet ticks. The virus, a delicate string of ribonucleic acid, had been deposited deep within the muscle tissue, where it began to bind to the acetylcholine receptors at the neuromuscular junctions. It was a silent invasion, a microscopic colonization that required no permission and offered no immediate symptoms. The man felt only the familiar ache of his joints and the biting chill of the wind, oblivious to the fact that his very essence was being overwritten by a lethal code. The frontier offered no sanctuary for the infected, for the concept of medical intervention was a hollow joke in a land where the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride away and likely an alcoholic fraud. The man continued his daily routine of breaking the earth and hauling water, his mind occupied by the mundane terrors of debt and drought. He did not know that the virus was already traveling, inch by agonizing inch, along the peripheral nerves toward his spinal cord. It moved with the steady, inexorable pace of a funeral procession, hidden beneath the surface of his tanned and weathered skin. To his neighbors, he was still a functioning unit of the settlement, a man who would soon be expected to contribute his labor to the communal harvest. As the weeks passed, the wound on his thumb healed into a pale, insignificant scar, a deceptive mask for the horror unfolding within his nervous system. The incubation period of hydrophobia is a cruel waiting room, a time of false peace where the host remains blissfully ignorant of their status as a walking corpse. The men began to notice a slight tingling in his arm, a phantom itch that he dismissed as a symptom of the cold or the onset of rheumatism. He did not realize that the virus had reached the dorsal root ganglia, preparing for its final assault on the brain. The tragedy of the frontier was not just the violence of the bullet or the blade, but the quiet, cellular betrayals that occurred in the silence of the wilderness. Civilization continued its frantic, clumsy expansion around him, oblivious to the singular tragedy brewing in the heart of Section 42. New families arrived in wagons, their faces bright with the same doomed optimism that had once animated the men now marked for death. They built fences and dug wells, unaware that they were merely adding more fuel to the fire of a landscape that specialized in the consumption of human hope. The man watched them from his porch, his hand twitching slightly as the first tendrils of neurological decay began to fray the edges of his consciousness. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the indifferent executioner was ready to pull the lever on a performance of suffering that would strip away every last vestige of his humanity. The year 1884 did not arrive on the high plains with the fanfare of progress or the heralds of a new age, but rather with the same biting frost and indifferent silence that had characterized every winter since the first plow broke the sod. On the desolate periphery of a sun-scorched settlement, where the horizon offered nothing but a flat, agonizing promise of more emptiness, lived a man whose identity was being systematically dismantled by the environment he sought to conquer. His name had already begun to fade from the memories of the local land office, replaced by a series of numbers and debt obligations that defined his worth far more accurately than his character ever could. He was the quintessential product of Western expansion, a biological machine, worn down to the gears, vibrating with the exhaustion of 1,000 unrewarded days. His hands were no longer the instruments of a craftsman but had become calloused shovels, cracked and stained with the dark, unyielding grease of the earth. The socio-economic landscape of the frontier was a predatory ecosystem, far more efficient at culling the weak than any wolf pack or drought. Every settler was an unwitting participant in a grand, cruel experiment designed to turn human suffering into liquid capital for the men in three-piece suits 1,000 miles to the east. The man's life was a constant, losing battle against the entropy of the plains, where the interest rates on his mortgage grew faster than the wheat in his fields. His existence was not a heroic saga of triumph over nature, but a grinding, physiological tax paid in sweat, bone density, and the slow evaporation of his sanity. He lived in a sod house that smelled of damp earth, rotting straw, and the unwashed reality of a family whose survival depended on the suppression of their own humanity. In this world of scarcity, the distinction between man and beast was a thin, fraying line maintained only by a few tattered rags and the repetition of a few memorized prayers. The interior of his dwelling was a testament to the brutal pragmatism of the frontier, where every object had to justify its existence through utility. A rusted stove, a few cracked plates, and a pallet of corn husks were the sum total of his worldly success, a meager barrier against the encroaching wild. The air inside was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the lingering odor of boiled cabbage, a heavy atmosphere that seemed to press down on the lungs of everyone within its walls. It was here, in the dead of a winter night, that the indifferent hand of biological fate decided to intervene in the man's already precarious struggle for survival. The intruder did not arrive with a roar or a display of strength, but with the erratic, jerky movements of a creature whose mind had been hollowed out by a microscopic invader. A small skunk, its fur matted and its eyes clouded with a milky, unnatural focus, slipped through a gap in the rotting floorboards with the silence of a terminal thought. This animal was no longer a functioning part of the natural order. It was a biological delivery system for the rabies virus, a pathogen that thrives on the destruction of the nervous system. The virus had already rewritten the skunk's evolutionary code, replacing its instinct for flight with a mindless, twitching aggression that demanded it lash out at anything that crossed its path. It moved through the shadows of the cabin like a dark omen, its presence unnoticed by the exhausted men sleeping on the floor. When the men shifted in his sleep, his hand falling from the edge of the pallet onto the cold, dirt floor, the animal did not hesitate. It was a brief, almost clinical interaction, a sharp, needle-like puncture in the soft flesh of his palm, followed by the frantic scratching of claws as the creature retreated back into the darkness. The man awoke with a sharp intake of breath, a momentary flash of pain cutting through the heavy fog of his fatigue, but he did not cry out. In a life defined by physical trauma, by the kick of a mule, the bite of a freezing wind, and the constant abrasion of manual labor, a small wound on the hand was an insignificance. He wiped the tiny droplets of blood on his trousers, muttered a curse under his breath, and drifted back into a restless sleep, unaware that his death warrant had just been signed in the invisible ink of a viral infection. The rabies virus, a rhabdovirus shaped like a hollow-point bullet, did not rush to claim its prize. It possessed the terrifying, geologic patience of the land itself. Once deposited in the muscle tissue of the palm, it began a slow, methodical colonization of the host's nervous system, binding to the receptors at the neuromuscular junctions with an agonizing precision. This was a silent invasion, a microscopic manifest destiny that mirrored the man's own encroachment upon the plains. For days, then weeks, the man went about his business, his body a silent battlefield where the virus marched inch by inch toward the spinal cord. He felt the familiar aches of his joints and the dull throb of his tired heart, never suspecting that a foreign code was currently remapping his brain. The winter gave way to a deceptive spring, a season that offered the illusion of renewal while the man's internal clock continued its terminal countdown. He spent his days behind a plow, the leather reins wrapped around the very hand that carried the seeds of his destruction. The wound had healed perfectly, leaving behind nothing but a faint, silvery scar that was easily ignored amidst the map of older injuries that decorated his skin. To his wife and children, he was still the same stoic pillar of their meager world, a man who provided the bread and the protection they needed to survive another year of isolation. Yet, beneath the surface, the virus had reached the dorsal root ganglia, the gateway to the central nervous system, and was preparing to ignite a neurological firestorm. The economy of the frontier did not allow for the luxury of illness. To stop working was to invite starvation, and to seek medical help was to admit a vulnerability that the community could not tolerate. The nearest doctor was a 3-day journey across a landscape that offered no shelter, and his skills were often limited to the application of leeches and the amputation of gangrenous limbs. The men knew that his survival depended on his utility, and so he pushed through the first, subtle signs of the infection. A slight tingling in his arm, a brief, unexplained shiver, a moment of irritability that flared up without cause, all were dismissed as the inevitable side effects of a life lived at the edge of endurance. He was a prisoner of his own resilience, trapped in a cycle of labor that prevented him from noticing the slow unraveling of his own mind. The sociological structure of the settlement was built on the foundation of collective denial, where the suffering of the individual was suppressed for the sake of the group's morale. No one wanted to look too closely at the man's increasingly haggard appearance or the way his eyes seemed to dart toward the shadows with a new, frantic energy. To acknowledge his decline was to acknowledge the fragility of their own existence, a truth too heavy to bear in a place where the wind never stopped screaming. They talked of the weather, of the price of grain, and of the coming railroad, using the language of commerce to drown out the sound of their own encroaching mortality. The men participated in these rituals of normalcy, his voice growing raspier, his movements more brittle, as the virus began its final assault on the brainstem. As the incubation period drew to a close, the man's perception of reality began to fracture, the edges of his world fraying like the hem of an old coat. The bright prairie sun, once his only guide, became an agonizing assault on his optic nerves, forcing him to squint against a light that felt like a physical weight. The sounds of the household, the clatter of plates, the laughter of his children, the rhythmic creak of the floorboards, started to grate on his psyche with the intensity of a sharpening stone. He found himself retreating into the dim corners of the cabin, his mind a chaotic whirl of rising anxiety and unformed dread. The virus was no longer just a physical presence, it had become an existential parasite, devouring his personality and replacing it with a raw, animalistic terror. The final stage of the infection approached with the inevitability of a winter storm moving across the plains. The virus had successfully navigated the labyrinth of his nerves and was now proliferating within the gray matter of his brain, hijacking the very circuits that governed his emotions and his basic survival instincts. He was becoming a stranger to himself, a passenger in a body that was increasingly driven by an external, destructive will. The irony of his situation was a bitter, historical joke. The man who had come to the West to find freedom was now a slave to a microscopic dictator, his every thought and action dictated by a sequence of proteins. He was no longer a farmer, a husband, or a pioneer. He was a biological vessel for the rabies virus, waiting for the first spark of hydrophobia to set his entire world on fire. In the small settlement, the air grew thick with the anticipation of a different kind of harvest, one that had nothing to do with the fields or the cattle. The man's neighbors noticed the change, the way he avoided the communal well, the way his breath came in short, jagged gasps whenever the wind carried the scent of rain. They watched him from a distance, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and a cold, pragmatic calculation. They knew the signs, for the frontier was a place where the ancient horrors of nature were never far from the surface. They began to tighten the bolts on their own doors, to keep their children closer to the hearth, and to wait for the inevitable moment when the man's humanity would finally snap under the weight of the madness. The transformation was nearly complete, the man's mind now a landscape of distorted shadows and neurological static. Every swallow of saliva felt like a betrayal, a reminder of the thirst he could no longer quench and the water he could no longer touch. He sat in the darkness of his cabin, his hands clutching the rough wood of his chair, his body vibrating with a tension that threatened to shatter his very bones. The virus had achieved its goal, turning a human being into a weapon of its own propagation, a tragic end for a man who had only ever wanted to carve a life out of the dirt. Outside, the prairie remained as silent and indifferent as ever, a vast, unfeeling witness to the final, agonizing collapse of a single, disposable life in the year 1884. 42 days had crawled across the calendar since the silent encounter in the dark, a span of time during which the men had remained a functioning, albeit weary, component of the agricultural machine. The virus had completed its long, subterranean pilgrimage from the nerves of his palm to the delicate architecture of the brainstem, and now it was ready to claim its dividends. It began with a subtle, pervasive sense of impending doom, a chemical anxiety that the men initially attributed to the material failures of his life. On the frontier, dread was the default emotional state. One feared the early frost, the sudden dip in the price of beef, or the silent approach of a debt collector. He spent his mornings staring at the horizon, his fingers twitching with a restlessness he could not name, believing that the source of his unease lay somewhere in the parched dirt of his failing fields. The environment of the high plains in the year 1884 was a cruel accomplice to his unfolding tragedy, providing a backdrop of heat and dust that masked the initial fevers of the infection. The sun was a white-hot hammer, beating the landscape into submission, while the wind carried the fine, abrasive grit of the desert that clogged the pores and irritated the eyes. The men moved through his chores with a growing lethargy, his skin slick with a cold, greasy sweat that never seemed to evaporate. To his family, he appeared merely as another victim of the unrelenting summer, his irritability and sudden outbursts of temper seen as the natural reactions of a man whose labor was being systematically erased by the climate. They did not see the microscopic fire burning through his gray matter, nor did they hear the discordant symphony of his firing neurons as they began to short-circuit. The domestic sphere of the sod house was a claustrophobic theater of biological decay, where the smell of boiling fat and unwashed bedding hung heavy in the stagnant air. Within these four walls, the man's transformation began to take on a more physical, visceral character that defied the simple explanations of fatigue. He found himself recoiling from the small window, the shafts of morning light striking his retinas like needles of molten lead. The sounds of his children playing, the high-pitched laughter and the rhythmic thud of their feet on the hard-packed earth, became an unbearable assault on his senses. He was becoming a stranger to the very life he had spent decades building, a passenger in an anatomy that was increasingly hostile to the outside world. Then came the moment of biological epiphany, the horrifying realization that the most fundamental element of survival had become his greatest enemy. In a geography where water was the ultimate currency, where wells were dug hundreds of feet into the unforgiving stone, the man discovered that he could no longer participate in the ritual of hydration. He stood over the wooden bucket in the corner of the kitchen, his throat parched and screaming for relief, yet his hands refused to lift the dipper to his lips. The mere sight of the liquid, shimmering with a dull, reflected light, triggered a violent upheaval in his diaphragm. It was a primordial rejection, an ancient reflex hijacked by the virus to prevent the host from washing away the infectious saliva that was now pooling in his mouth. The first attempt to drink was a catastrophic failure of the man's physical autonomy, a scene of quiet, agonizing absurdity. As he forced himself to bring a tin cup of water toward his face, his neck muscles seized with the force of an iron vice, twisting his head away in an involuntary spasm. The water splashed onto the floor, soaking into the dry dirt, and the man collapsed against the wall, his breath coming in jagged, wheezing gasps. His throat felt as though it had been fused shut, a solid column of muscle that refused to yield to the commands of his conscious mind. This was the dark irony of the frontier, to die of thirst in a land where men killed for water, simply because a protein chain had rewritten the rules of his physiology. His wife watched this display from across the room, her hands frozen in the act of kneading dough, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and a rising, instinctive terror. She saw not a sick husband, but a breakdown of the natural order, a man who had survived the violence of the plains now undone by a cup of water. In the pragmatic, joyless world of the homestead, there was no vocabulary for such a phenomenon, there was only the cold observation that the primary engine of their economic survival was malfunctioning. She did muted calculations of their remaining grain, of the cost of a burial, and of the likelihood that she would have to carry the harvest alone. Her grief was not a sentimental outpouring, but a hard, jagged fear rooted in the realization that they were now vulnerable to the indifferent cruelty of the land. The man's condition continued to deteriorate as the virus took total command of his motor functions, turning his body into a site of constant, low-level neurological war. He retreated to his bed, a pallet of corn husks that crackled with every twitch of his limbs, the air around him thick with the smell of his own accelerating panic. Every swallow of his own saliva, which he could no longer suppress, caused a miniature version of the hydrophobic spasm, a sharp, suffocating catch in his throat that left him gasping for air. He was trapped in a feedback loop of thirst and terror, his mind still clear enough to understand the horror of his situation, but powerless to intervene. The virus had effectively decapitated his will, leaving his consciousness to witness the slow, agonizing dismantling of his biological shell. Outside, the community of the settlement continued its frantic, indifferent activity, the neighbors passing by the cabin without a second glance. In the year 1884, the social fabric of the West was stitched with the thread of rugged individualism, a philosophy that served as a convenient mask for a total lack of empathy. A man who couldn't work was a man who didn't exist in the social hierarchy of the frontier, he was merely a ghost in waiting, a temporary occupant of land that would soon belong to someone more resilient. If they heard the muffled sounds of his struggle, they dismissed them as the common noises of a household in distress, a private tragedy that held no value in the broader economy of the plains. The isolation of the homestead was not just physical, but psychological, a deliberate wall built to protect the living from the sight of the dying. By the second night of the symptomatic phase, the man's world had narrowed to the sensation of his own parched tissues and the rhythmic, agonizing jolts of his nervous system. The fever had reached a pitch where his skin felt translucent, stretched thin over the sharp angles of his bones like wet parchment over a cage. He began to hallucinate, the shadows in the corners of the room morphing into the distorted shapes of the animals he had spent his life slaughtering. He saw the skunk from 42 days ago, its eyes glowing with a cold, viral intelligence, a silent witness to the success of its microscopic mission. The man tried to scream, but the sound was strangled in his throat, emerging as a dry, rattling hiss that carried no human meaning. The virus had achieved a state of perfect dominance, using the man's fear and pain to facilitate its own potential transmission. His mouth was now a reservoir of concentrated infection, the saliva thick and frothy, containing millions of copies of the rhabdovirus waiting for a new host. In his moments of clarity, he looked at his wife and children with a desperate, pleading intensity, a silent warning to stay away from the biological trap he had become. Yet, the instinct to comfort the dying was a stubborn remnant of their shared humanity, a dangerous impulse that threatened to pull them into the same terminal spiral. The cabin had become a laboratory of suffering, where the bond of family was being tested against the ruthless efficiency of a pathogen that cared nothing for love or history. As the sun began to rise on the third day, the man's physical appearance had become a grotesque caricature of his former self. His eyes were sunken and yellowed, reflecting a mind that was being slowly extinguished by inflammation and cellular death. The muscles of his face were locked in a perpetual grimace, his lips pulled back to reveal teeth that had spent decades grinding down the tough, fibrous food of the poor. He was no longer a farmer or a pioneer, he was a monument to the fragility of the human experiment on the frontier. The great expansion, with its locomotives and telegraph lines, stopped at the threshold of his skin, unable to offer even a single drop of relief to a man whose throat had become a barricade against life itself. The sociological reality of the situation was becoming increasingly clear to the wife as she stood in the doorway, the light of the dawn revealing the full extent of the devastation. She realized that there would be no recovery, no miraculous intervention from the distant, expensive world of science. The man she had known was already gone, replaced by a twitching, hydrophobic wreck that was a danger to everyone in the household. In her mind, the transition from caregiver to executioner was already beginning, a cold, pragmatic shift necessitated by the absolute lack of alternatives. The frontier did not permit the luxury of prolonged suffering, it demanded a resolution that was as swift and indifferent as the nature that had caused the wound in the first place. The man lay on the floor, his body vibrating with the final, frantic energy of a dying machine, his mind a flickering candle in a hurricane of neurological noise. He could hear the wind outside, the same wind that had driven him to this godforsaken patch of dirt, and it sounded to him like the laughter of an indifferent god. He was dying of thirst in a world that was 60% water, a final, bitter joke played by a biology that viewed him as nothing more than a temporary vessel. The history of the West was not written in the blood of heroes, but in the saliva of the mad and the silent, grinding misery of those who were consumed by the very land they tried to tame. 42 days of incubation had led to this, a man, a cabin, and the absolute, terrifying realization that civilization was nothing more than a thin veil over an abyss of viral rage. The iron bed stood as a skeletal remain of a former life, a heavy, rusting artifact transported across 2,000 miles of unforgiving terrain only to become a makeshift gallows in the year 1884. It had been forged in a foundry in Pennsylvania, intended to be a place of rest, procreation, and eventual peaceful exploration, yet here on the edge of the world, it served as the final anchor for a body that was no longer its own master. The man was lashed to the frame with lengths of coarse hemp rope, the fibers biting into his wrists and ankles until the skin began to weep a thin, straw-colored fluid that mixed with the grime of the frontier. Each time his muscles seized in a violent, involuntary protest, the iron frame shrieked against the uneven dirt floor, a rhythmic, metallic cry that echoed the internal fragmentation of his nervous system. There was no dignity in this bondage, only the cold, hard logic of a family attempting to prevent a father from tearing his own flesh apart in a moment of viral delirium. The skin on his face had undergone a terrifying transformation, stretching so tightly over the underlying bone that it appeared translucent, like wet parchment drying in the sun. This tension had pulled his lips back into the classic rhesus sardonicus, a morbid, permanent grin that exposed his yellowed, tobacco-stained teeth to the stale air of the cabin. It was a mask of mirth that contained no joy, a biological caricature of a human expression caused by the constant, agonizing contraction of the facial muscles. His eyes, once capable of tracking the slow movement of clouds across the Kansas sky, were now bloodshot orbs that darted with a predatory, unfocused intensity, reflecting a mind that had been reduced to a flickering candle in a hurricane. The humanity had been drained out of him, replaced by the ancient, reptilian survival code of the rhabdovirus, leaving behind a husk that merely looked like the men who had once built this home. From his mouth, which he could northwest longer close, flowed a constant, viscous stream of saliva that he was physically unable to swallow due to the paralysis of his throat. This fluid did not merely drip, it bubbled and frothed at the corners of his lips, forming a thick, grayish foam that clung to his stubble like the residue of some foul chemical reaction. To the virus, this saliva was the primary vehicle for its own propagation, a concentrated broth of infection waiting for a new host to bite or an open wound to enter. The man's inability to swallow was not just a symptom of his suffering, but a deliberate design of the pathogen to ensure that the infectious material remained in the mouth, ready for transmission. He was no longer a person in the eyes of biology, he was a highly efficient, twitching delivery system for a microscopic parasite that cared nothing for his history or his soul. The air inside the cramped, windowless room had become a heavy, suffocating miasma of organic failure and mounting despair. It was thick with the sharp, stinging scent of concentrated ammonia from unmanaged waste, the sour odor of old, fermented sweat, and the unmistakable musk of a predator's den. This was the smell of the frontier stripped of its romantic lies, the scent of a biological machine breaking down under the weight of a superior adversary. The family, huddled in the adjacent room, breathed in this atmosphere of decay every hour of the day, their own clothes and hair becoming infused with the stench of their father's dissolution. There was no incense or perfume that could mask the reality of the situation. The smell of hydrophobia was the smell of the abyss, a visceral reminder that in the wilderness, man was nothing more than a temporary arrangement of meat and bone. Deep within the man's cranium, the virus had successfully executed its coup d'état, seizing total control of the limbic system and the brainstem. It had stripped away the thin veneer of social conditioning and moral restraint that separates a citizen from a beast, leaving behind only raw, unadulterated rage and a primal fear of the environment. Every neuron was firing in a chaotic, discordant symphony, sending signals of phantom pain and imaginary threats to a consciousness that could no longer filter them. He was trapped in a permanent state of high-arousal terror, a neurological nightmare where the entire world was perceived as a lethal enemy. The virus had rewritten his fundamental instincts, turning the very air he breathed and the water he craved into sources of existential agony, ensuring that his final days were spent in a state of maximum psychological and physical torment. One of the most grotesque manifestations of this neurological hijack was the man's sudden, violent reaction to the slightest movement of the air, a condition known as aerophobia. A simple draft whistling through a gap in the sod walls, a breath of wind that would have been a blessing in the July heat, now acted upon his nervous system like a bolt of raw electricity. The mere sensation of a cooling breeze against his fevered skin triggered a massive, full-body convulsion that threatened to snap his bones against the iron rails of the bed. His back would arch with such prehistoric force that his spine seemed ready to shatter, his chest heaving as he fought for air that his throat refused to let pass. Nature, in its infinite and chilling indifference, used the very atmosphere as a whip, ensuring that even the act of breathing became a source of unmitigated torture for the infected. The sound of his breathing had changed from a human rasp into a series of staccato, guttural barks and whistling gasps that signaled the total collapse of his laryngeal control. In the folklore of the West, these sounds were often misinterpreted as the man literally turning into a dog or a coyote, but the reality was far more grounded in the grim physics of a failing anatomy. Each sound was the result of air being dragged through a throat that was constantly spasming, a violent collision between the biological necessity of oxygen and the viral refusal to allow anything to enter the esophagus. This barking was the voice of the frontier's dark side, a noise that carried across the quiet plains at night, informing any listening neighbor that another soul had been claimed by the madness. It was a sound that haunted the dreams of the children, a linguistic erasure of their father that replaced his soft-spoken words with the cold, mechanical noise of a dying animal. Outside the cabin, the sun continued its slow, golden descent toward the horizon, illuminating a landscape that was as beautiful as it was lethal. The vast expanses of grass, the rolling hills, and the distant mountains were all parts of a grand, unfeeling mechanism that viewed the man's struggle with the same apathy it viewed the death of a field mouse. The sociology of the frontier was built on this very indifference. A man who could no longer work the land or defend his property was a man who had already been discarded by the collective. There were no hospitals for the mad, no hospices for the dying, only the desperate, improvised measures taken by those left behind in the wake of the disaster. The community, such as it was, had already begun to distance itself, the social bonds fraying as the neighbors calculated the risk of contagion against the dwindling value of the man's friendship. In his rare moments of lucidity, which were becoming shorter and more infrequent as the inflammation of the brain progressed, the man might have caught a glimpse of his own reflection in a bucket of water or the wide eyes of his wife. In those fleeting seconds, the horror of his situation must have been a weight more crushing than the illness itself. He was a prisoner in his own skin, watching as his identity was methodically deleted by a sequence of proteins. He was witnessing the death of his name, the end of his legacy, and the transformation of his body into a source of terror for those he loved most. The virus had not only taken his life, it had stolen his ending, replacing a dignified departure with a frantic, foaming scramble into the dark. The wife, a woman whose hands were permanently stained with the work of the farm and the soot of the stove, stood by the bed with a rag soaked in vinegar and water, her face a mask of exhausted pragmatism. She had seen her husband survive droughts, blizzards, and the threat of bankruptcy, but she knew that this was a battle that could not be won with a plow or a rifle. Her love had been tempered by the reality of the plains into something harder and more functional, a tool for survival rather than a sentiment of comfort. She watched the man's chest heave, noting the way the ropes frayed against the iron, and she understood that the time for mercy was approaching. In the silent economy of the West, the cost of keeping a madman alive was too high for a family that still had mouths to feed and fields to harvest. The room grew darker as the evening shadows lengthened, and the smell of the illness seemed to intensify in the cooling air, a thick, cloying presence that clung to the back of the throat. The man's convulsions had become almost continuous now, a rhythmic thrashing that vibrated through the floorboards and into the very foundation of the house. He was no longer a person in any recognizable sense, but a biological storm, a localized eruption of viral energy that was burning through its remaining fuel with terrifying speed. The transition from a human being into a specimen of disease was complete, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell that was destined to be forgotten as quickly as a dry bone in the desert. As the year 1884 prepared to turn its face away from this singular tragedy, the man on the iron bed reached the final threshold of his endurance. His heart, a muscle that had beaten with the rhythm of the seasons and the toil of the earth, began to stutter under the strain of the constant neurological assaults. The virus had extracted everything it could from the host, leaving him a broken, dehydrated wreck of a pioneer. There would be no monuments for him, no entries in the grand histories of the nation's growth, only the bitter memory of a death that was as lonely as the prairie and as cruel as the nature that had ordained it. The frontier moved on, its gears greased by the blood and saliva of those who fell by the wayside, a relentless engine of progress that had no memory of the screams that were silenced in the dark. The social fabric of the American frontier, often depicted as a tapestry of rugged communal strength and neighborly altruism, was in truth as thin and fragile as a moth-eaten shroud. In the year 1884, the myth of the pioneer brotherhood evaporated the moment the shadow of hydrophobia crossed the threshold of that lonely sod house. The surrounding community, a collection of equally desperate souls clinging to the dry hide of the plains, did not respond with prayers or hot meals, but with the cold, instinctive recoil of a herd sensing a predator in its midst. Neighbors who had shared seed and stories only a fortnight ago now found reasons to steer their wagons 3 miles wide of the property, their eyes averted from the structure that held the dying man. To them, he was no longer a friend or a pillar of the settlement, he was a biological hazard, a malfunctioning unit of labor that threatened the precarious equilibrium of their collective survival. This sudden isolation was a manifestation of the cruel pragmatism that governed the West, where human value was measured strictly in terms of calories produced and miles plowed. In the brutal accounting of the frontier, a man afflicted with the madness of rabies was a bad investment, a broken gear in the economic machinery of expansion. The sociology of the plains permitted no room for the prolonged maintenance of the unproductive. To be sick was to be a burden, and to be incurably mad was to be a pariah. The air around the cabin seemed to thicken with a perceived contagion, as if the very breath of the sufferer could poison the wind and wither the crops. This was the true nature of the frontier spirit, a desperate, shivering selfishness disguised as rugged individualism, where the only sin was becoming a liability to the group. Medicine on the edge of the world was a hollow, grisly joke, a collection of superstitions and toxic placebos that offered neither cure nor comfort. The local apothecary's shelves held little more than bottles of laudanum, castor oil, and sulfuric acid, substances more likely to hasten a man's journey to the grave than to soothe his passage. In a world where surgery was often conducted with a common wood saw and a bottle of cheap whiskey, the complex neurological devastation of rabies was viewed with a mixture of medieval terror and total scientific impotence. The doctors of the era, few and far between, were often little more than failed tradesmen who had swapped their hammers for scalpels, possessing no understanding of the microscopic world of viruses. They spoke of humors and miasmas while the rhabdovirus methodically liquidated the man's brain, their presence offering nothing but a bill that the family could never hope to pay. Religion, too, proved to be an impotent witness to the unfolding horror, its promises of salvation ringing hollow against the frantic, animalistic screams echoing from the iron bed. The family's tattered Bible, once a source of dubious hope, lay neglected on a grease-stained table, its verses unable to bridge the gap between divine providence and biological reality. The local preacher did not come to offer the last rites, for even the men of God feared the physical corruption that the disease represented. In the dark corners of the room, where the light from the failing oil lamp could not reach, the shadows seemed to dance with a mocking, primordial energy that predated any gospel. Faith was a luxury for the healthy. For those trapped in the hydrophobic spiral, there was only the cold, unfeeling silence of a universe that viewed their suffering with the same indifference it viewed the rot of a fallen tree. The interior of the cabin had become a laboratory of sensory horror, where the boundaries between the living and the dead had grown dangerously blurred. The walls of unbaked clay seemed to sweat with the humidity of the man's labor, while the floor remained a hard, dusty crust that swallowed the foam dripping from his mouth. Every object in the room, the rusted stove, the chipped ceramic bowl, the stack of moth-eaten blankets, carried the scent of a stagnant life reaching its terminal phase. The air was a putrid stew of organic smells, the metallic tang of dried blood, the sharp sting of unwashed waste, and the sickly sweet odor of a body that was already beginning to ferment from within. Within this confined space, the family lived in a state of perpetual, vibrating tension, their own sanity fraying as they watched the patriarch's slow descent into a state of total, barking madness. Time in the cabin was no longer measured by the rising of the sun or the ticking of a clock, but by the horrific, rhythmic intervals between the man's respiratory failures. The wife and children moved through the gloom like ghosts, their faces hollowed out by a fatigue that went deeper than bone. They had reached the limit of human endurance, their empathy drained away by the sheer, repetitive violence of the symptoms. To watch a loved one transform into a snarling, hydrophobic beast is to undergo a psychological amputation. The woman who had once loved this man now looked at him with the same detached, clinical eye one might use to assess a horse with a broken leg. The transition from wife to caretaker, and finally to a figure of grim necessity, was a path paved with the loss of every sentiment that makes a life bearable. By the 15th day of the symptomatic phase, the man's cries had lost all semblance of human language, dissolving into a series of guttural, rattling hones that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the sod house. His body, once the engine of the farm's success, was now a skeletal wreckage of knotted muscles and protruding ribs, his skin stretched so tight it appeared ready to split open. The ropes that held him to the iron bed had worn deep, crimson grooves into his limbs, exposing the white of the tendons beneath. He was a creature of pure reflex now, a biological anomaly that continued to draw breath only through the stubborn, mindless persistence of the brainstem. The sight of him was an affront to the living, a visceral reminder of the fragility of the human form when pitted against the microscopic architects of decay. The decision to end the performance was not reached through a grand moral struggle, but emerged as a cold, inevitable conclusion born of pure exhaustion. The wife, her eyes bleached of color by the relentless sun of the plains and the salt of 1,000 unshed tears, looked at the shaking frame of her husband and saw only a chore that needed finishing. There was no poetry in her heart, only the heavy, leaden weight of a life that had been reduced to a sequence of grim tasks. She knew that the community would not help, that the law was a distant rumor, and that the only mercy available in this godforsaken territory was the mercy one delivered with one's own hands. She looked at the heavy pillow on the chair, a sack of coarse ticking stuffed with the stiff, pungent feathers of the chickens she had plucked with these same tired fingers. As she approached the bed, the man's bloodshot eyes rolled in his head, catching the dim light of the dying embers in the hearth. Whether there was a spark of recognition in that gaze or merely the panicked firing of dying neurons, she did not allow herself to consider. She moved with the mechanical precision of a butcher, her mind focused only on the physical mechanics of the act. The pillow was heavy, smelling of dust and the faint, lingering odor of the poultry yard, a domestic object transformed into an instrument of terminal quiet. In the year 1884, on the edge of a world that cared for nothing but expansion and profit, the life of a single farmer was worth less than the air he was struggling to breathe. The act of suffocation was a slow, labor-intensive process that lacked any of the grace of a fictional tragedy. She pressed the pillow down with the full weight of her body, her knees braced against the dirt floor, her arms shaking with the effort of suppressed resistance. Beneath the fabric, the man's body made its final, desperate protest, his spine arching in a series of violent jolts that rattled the iron frame of the bed. It was a struggle of pure biology, a collision of two organisms in a small room at the end of the world. She felt the hot, damp breath of his last efforts through the material, a frantic, humid heat that gradually cooled as the oxygen in his blood was depleted. There was no lightning, no dramatic swell of music, only the muffled sound of a man's life being extinguished by a tired woman in a dirty dress. When the last tremor finally subsided, a sound like a dry twig snapping echoed through the room, the quiet, definitive crack of a cervical vertebra yielding to the strain of the struggle. The wife did not move for a long time, her weight still pressing the pillow into the face of the man who had been her partner for 15 years. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the whistling of the wind through the cracks in the sod walls, a lonely, persistent noise that had outlasted every inhabitant of the plains. The room was finally still, the frantic, viral energy that had occupied it for weeks now dissipating into the cold, indifferent air. She stood up, her joints popping in the quiet, and looked down at the hands that had just completed the final economic transaction of her marriage. The death of the men was not a tragedy in the eyes of the frontier, it was a successful resolution to a problematic situation. The virus had been contained, the broken machine had been stilled, and the land remained, ready to be tilled by the next fool who believed in the promise of the West. Outside, the prairie continued its eternal, swaying dance under a vast and empty sky, the grass indifferent to the fact that it would soon be nourished by the remains of the men who had tried to conquer it. The history of the conquest of the West was built on these silent, suffocating moments, on the pragmatic cruelties of those who survived to tell the story. In the cabin, the silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that covered the truth of the frontier, that out here, under the gaze of an indifferent God, the only true peace was the peace found at the bottom of a shallow, unmarked grave. The sun rose over the horizon like a jaundiced and bruised eye, casting a pale, sickly light across a landscape that remained as stubborn and merciless as it had been 40 days prior. The high plains of 1884 did not offer a moment of silence for the departed. The wind simply continued its relentless, abrasive dialogue with the dry grass, carrying away the last echoes of the man's final, suffocating struggle. In the wake of the night's desperate mercy, the earth waited with a callous patience to receive the biological debris that had once been a husband, a father, and a pioneer. There was no majesty in this morning, only the cold, gray reality of a chore that needed to be completed before the heat of the day could accelerate the inevitable process of putrefaction. The ground, hardened by a lack of rain and the crushing weight of geological time, felt like iron beneath the spade, an unyielding vault that surrendered its space only with the greatest of reluctance. The burial was a stripped-down, mechanical affair, devoid of the liturgical lace and hollow sentimentality that the East used to mask the ugliness of death. There were no black-clad mourners, no polished mahogany caskets, and certainly no priest to mutter platitudes about a better world to a family whose only world was one of dirt and debt. The body, wrapped in a tattered, lye-stained sheet that smelled of old sweat and wood smoke, was lowered into a shallow trench that barely accommodated the skeletal remains. Every shovelful of dust that fell upon the shroud sounded like a drumbeat of total erasure, a rhythmic thudding that signaled the final disconnection of a human life from the economic and social grid of the frontier. The widow did not weep with the operatic intensity found in cheap novels. Her eyes were dry and red-rimmed, her face a mask of exhausted pragmatism as she focused on the physical labor of concealing her failure from the sun. To protect the remains from the local scavengers, who viewed the settlement as a convenient larder of poorly buried biomass, the family spent the afternoon hauling heavy, jagged stones to pile atop the mound. This was the only monument the men would ever receive, a cairn of nameless rocks intended to thwart the inquisitive snouts of coyotes and the talons of vultures. The work was grueling, the sharp edges of the stones tearing at the widow's calloused palms, yet it was a necessary tax paid to the land to ensure that the memory of the infection did not literally resurface. Below those stones lay the evidence of a biological disaster, a sequence of nerves and brain matter that had been liquidized by the rhabdovirus, now slowly returning to its elemental constituents. The cairn stood as a silent admission that on the frontier, the primary goal was not to remember the dead, but to prevent them from becoming a nuisance to the living. By noon, the focus of the household had already shifted from the spiritual to the structural, as the machinery of survival demanded immediate attention. The man's clothing, stiff with the salt of his final fevers and the foam of his madness, was taken behind the cabin and burned in a small, acrid fire that sent a plume of black smoke into the vast, indifferent sky. This was a ritual of hygiene rather than mourning, a frantic attempt to incinerate the physical traces of the tragedy before they could take root in the minds of the children. Every item he had touched, the tin cup he could not drink from, the ropes that had held him to the iron bed, the very corn husks of his palate, was treated as a source of potential contagion, an extension of the virus that had dismantled his identity. The family watched the fire with a detached, hollowed-out intensity, seeing not the destruction of a man's legacy, but the necessary sterilization of a crime scene. 6 miles to the east, in a cramped and drafty office that smelled of stale tobacco and cheap ink, the grand machinery of Western expansion continued its rhythmic, bureaucratic grind, entirely unaware of the hole in the ground on Section 42. The local land agent, a man whose soul had been replaced by a series of ledgers and title deeds, sat at a scarred oak desk, his fingers stained black with the residue of 1,000 commercial transactions. To him, the man who had just been buried was not a person, but a temporary occupant of a legal entity, a name on a piece of paper that had failed to meet its contractual obligations. The frontier was a vast ledger where the ink was often mixed with blood, and the agent's job was to ensure that the columns of profit and loss were always balanced, regardless of the human cost required to reach that equilibrium. The agent dipped his steel-nibbed pen into the inkwell and, with a single, practiced stroke, marked the man's file as a forfeiture due to the expiration of the primary claimant. There was no entry for the cause of death, no mention of the hydrophobia or the pillow or the 42 days of silent incubation. The law only recognized the failure to produce a harvest and the inability to pay the interest on the seed loan. In the socio-political architecture of 1884, a dead farmer was merely a vacancy, an opportunity for the next wave of capital to wash over the land and attempt to succeed where the previous tenant had been consumed. The agent felt no more remorse for this erasure than a gardener feels when pulling a weed, for he understood that the growth of the nation required a constant supply of fresh mulch. On the afternoon train, a soot-stained locomotive that shrieked across the plains like a mechanical banshee set the next iteration of the American dream, a young immigrant from the slums of a northern city, his heart bursting with the toxic illusions of the era. He wore a clean wool coat and held a satchel containing his life savings, his eyes fixed on the horizon as he dreamt of 1,000 acres of golden wheat and a life of honest, dignified labor. He had read the pamphlets distributed by the railroad companies, those glossy advertisements that depicted the West as a lush, providential garden waiting for the industrious hand of man. He did not know that he was traveling toward a graveyard, or that the soil he planned to plow was already saturated with the failures of men exactly like himself. He was the next unit of fuel for the fire, a fresh host for the aggressive virus of civilization that was devouring the continent. This cycle of arrival, struggle, and eventual decomposition was the true engine of progress, a grand metabolism that converted human hope into the infrastructure of an empire. The Wild West was not a place of heroic gunfights and noble outlaws, it was a sprawling, biological meat grinder that specialized in the systematic destruction of the individual for the benefit of the collective. Civilization, much like the rabies virus itself, possessed a relentless, expansionist code that demanded it colonize every available space, regardless of the resistance offered by the indigenous life or the environment. It used people as disposable cells, moving them into position, extracting their labor until they were spent, and then discarding them with a cold, institutional efficiency. The cities of the future were being built on foundations of forgotten bones, their rising skylines a testament to the sheer volume of biomass that had been sacrificed to the altar of the market. As the week drew to a close, the land agent was already shaking the hand of the new immigrant, handing over the keys to the cabin on Section 42 with a practiced, fraudulent smile. He did not mention the men buried under the rocks, nor did he speak of the foam that had bubbled on the lips of the previous tenant. Such details were bad for business and did not fit the narrative of triumphant expansion. The new settler walked onto the property with a sense of ownership that was as pathetic as it was misplaced, oblivious to the fact that the land was merely tolerating his presence until it was time to reclaim him. He saw the cairn of stones and assumed it was a natural feature of the landscape, a pile of rubble cleared from the field by a hard-working predecessor, rather than a lid on a box of horrors. The memory of the men who died of hydrophobia was thus perfectly and surgically removed from the historical record, replaced by the sanitized legends that the survivors preferred to tell themselves. Those who had lived through the winter and the madness chose to repackage their existential terror into stories of perseverance and grit, using the language of myth to drown out the sound of the barking and the sight of the pillow. It was a psychological necessity. To acknowledge the raw, unvarnished truth of the frontier was to admit that their lives were meaningless in the face of nature's indifference. They built churches and schools atop the sites of their greatest shames, creating a veneer of morality over a reality of brutal, animalistic survival. The West was not won by the brave, it was occupied by the lucky and the cold-hearted, who knew how to bury their mistakes deep enough to keep the ghosts from screaming. In the final accounting, death remained the only honest architect of the frontier, the only force that did not lie about its intentions or its outcomes. While the land agent sold his dreams and the preachers sold their heavens, the grave simply waited, an open mouth that never grew tired of being fed. The rabies virus, the droughts, the blizzards, and the crushing weight of debt were all merely different masks worn by the same executioner, a nature that viewed the human experiment with a profound and terrifying lack of interest. The history of the West is not a story of triumph, but a long, detailed autopsy of a dream that was dead before it even reached the Mississippi. We are the descendants of those who were fast enough with the shovel and the pillow, the heirs to a legacy of silence and the heavy, crushing weight of the stones. The wind continued to blow across the empty space where the men had lived, a low, moaning sound that carried no message and offered no comfort. Beneath the cairn, the process of decay was almost complete, the man's atoms dispersing into the dry soil to nourish the very grass he had spent his life trying to eradicate. There was no ghost to haunt the new settler, no lingering spirit of the infected to warn him of the dangers that lurked in the shadows of the floorboards. There was only the land, vast and indifferent, and the steady, ticking clock of a history that remembers nothing and forgives even less. The sun set once more, a fiery red bruise on the edge of the world, as the West moved forward into the darkness, its gears greased by the blood of the forgotten and the silent, foaming rage of the mad.